It's not news. The world can be dark. But this is our moment to respond.
We served over 46,000 meals. There is a shelter for women and children.
We at IVC get up each day and put our skills, our life experiences, and our hearts into building something good, something healing, something holy. We are witness to the men and women of the Corps as they light up the lives of others. And our hope is catching. Last year, we grew to more than 600 Service Corps members across 24 cities. We launched new regional offices in Albany, New Orleans, and Portland, Maine. And even more cities are actively seeking to develop an IVC Service Corps in their region. Our Jesuit university and college partnerships now include the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, Lemoyne College in Syracuse, Loyola University, Maryland in Baltimore, Marquette University in Milwaukee, the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania, Loyola University, Chicago, and Georgetown University. At least a half dozen other schools are inquiring how their alumni can join the IVC movement. Our supporters don't just join the ranks of the Service Corps and partner agencies, they sustain us with their generosity. This is our response to the darkness. At IVC, we experience hope in the flesh. We touch incarnation. And it's not lofty theology to us. God's love is a living, breathing reality.
Good evening and welcome. We are so glad you can join us for our webinar discussion on election 2020, Catholic Conscience, the Candidates, and the Common Good. The IVC region of New York, Long Island, and Northern New Jersey is happy to be hosting this virtual dialogue. I am Maureen Fulham, IVC Regional Director. We are also grateful for so many IVC Service Corps members, friends, benefactors who are attending from many parts of our country. And of course, a special welcome to our moderator and our panelists. So as we begin, let us take a moment during these days, let us pray. Center ourselves, remember we're in the presence of our God, our loving God. Loving God, send your spirit on our panelists and participants this evening. May this discussion enlighten our minds and move our hearts in order that during these days leading up to the election, we may follow yet more closely the teaching and example of Jesus, your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen. Amen. And I hear amen resounding through cyberspace. Well, here we are, 6 days before our presidential election and several important elections throughout the country. In the midst of a hard-fought campaign, a global pandemic, an economy experiencing dramatic swings, and a nation trying to come to terms with racial injustice. And what better time to gather us together to talk about the election? We have a great group of leaders with us tonight. Our evening is moderated generously by Father James Martin, a Jesuit priest for 32 years, consulted to the Vatican Secretariat for Communication, renowned author and editor at large for America Magazine. Hello, Jim. Our distinguished panelists are John Carr, founder and director of the Initiative of Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. And of course, John Carr is an author. He recently wrote one of many articles, one on faithful citizenship in America, which appeared in America Magazine. John Carr has represented the Bishops' Conference before Congress at the Vatican, across the US and around the world. Welcome, John. Barbara Lee. Hi, Barbara. Spiritual director and author with a ministry to the aging, and also a retired US Magistrate Judge. Barbara wrote recently a widely acclaimed book, God Isn't Finished With Me Yet, Discovering the Spiritual Graces of Later Life. Barbara is a longtime Ignatian Volunteer Corps service member and serves on the IVC Regional Council. Eric Van Nostrand, Social Committee Chair at St. Ignatius Loyola Parish in New York City. The committee works to make a difference on issues consistent with Catholic social teaching. Eric is head of macro research at a global investment company and formerly an economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors during the Obama administration. Hello, Eric. I'm grateful to know all of you folks, and we're honored to have you all here. We have a great group of panelists, as I said, a great moderator. As we get started, an important word to our Zoom participants. We invite you and encourage you to submit questions during this time. Please do this through the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer them, or at least discuss them. With that, I turn the next segment over to Father James Martin.
Well, thank you, Maureen. And I want to thank Maureen and Mary McGinnity and all the wonderful people at IVC for inviting me. I am a huge fan of IVC. Watching that video just reminds me again what a wonderful ministry it is. And I'm really honored to be here. And when I was asked to moderate this panel, I was stunned at how good the panel was and how rich experiences people bring to the table. So what I'm going to do very briefly, just so you know what's coming, I'm going to speak very briefly on the formation of conscience in the Catholic Church, very briefly. Then I'll turn it over to John Carr, who will speak about faithful citizenship, which is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops document that he has had a lot of experience with. And then Barbara Lee will speak about the common good. What is the common good? And then Eric Van Nostrand will speak about the role of faith in political decision making. And by the way, just to make it easier, I think we can call one another by our first name. So very briefly, where does conscience fit into all of this? Well, I would say conscience fits into all of this at the very top, right, or at the very center. One of the most unfortunate things over the last, I would say 30 or 40 years in the Catholic Church, and there are a number of reasons for this, which I won't go into right now, has been the sidelining or the kind of ignoring, or sometimes even the negation of the ancient Catholic tradition of the primacy of conscience. Okay, and what does that mean? That means that in the moral life, and this is, when I say this to groups, they think I'm making it up or I'm actually creating something new. In the moral life, the final arbiter of moral actions and moral decision makings, is what's called the informed conscience or the formed conscience. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, that means a conscience that knows the Gospels, first of all, that knows Jesus, that knows what Jesus does in the Gospels and his way of proceeding, as Jesuits like to say, right? His care for the poor and for the marginalized, his healing of the sick, his preaching of the reign of God, his emphasis on love and forgiveness. So a formed conscience would know that and would really, and also would have an experience of an encounter with Christ. The second would be that a formed conscience is one that understands church teaching. Okay, now obviously you cannot understand or know 2,000 years of church teaching and every single line in the catechism and every single encyclical, but in general, what the church teaches on the major issues of the day, or whatever you are kind of bringing your conscience to bear. And then you study the issues in a time of an election. You study the issues. It's not simply knowing what the church teaches, but it's how to apply it. An example would be like Laudato Si. So you apply Laudato Si to some of the questions about climate change, and then you use your conscience and you vote. Okay, now despite what a lot of people are telling you, what you might be hearing, you're not going to go to hell for voting for one or another candidate. You're not going to go to hell for voting for a Democrat or for voting for a Republican. St. Thomas Aquinas felt so strongly about this that he said that he would rather ignore church teaching than go against his conscience. Okay, so I just wanted to foreground that because I really think that this has been lost in the last 30 or 40 years. So that's the primacy of conscience. And for a lot of people, Pope Francis uses this quite a bit, right? And this is one reason we see Pope Francis talking so much about discernment, a popular Jesuit concept, and why he uses the tool of the synod. Okay, so the synod, the great gathering of bishops and clergy and religious and lay people, because he trusts that the Holy Spirit is at work in the individual person and in the individual conscience. So to sum up, as Pope Francis said, the church is meant to form consciences, not to replace them. So a little about the primacy of conscience. And now I'm very excited to hear what our friend John Carr has to say about a document he's very familiar with called Faithful Citizenship.
Thank you, Father Jim. And like Jim, I'm a great admirer of IVC. We've had somebody work with our initiative who was an IVC member. This is sort of my Ignatian week. I began this weekend at the Ignatian teach-in and tonight with IVC in New York. And to be with Father Jim and Eric and Barbara and Maureen is a real pleasure. What strikes me is this is an Ignatian moment. I'm not a Jesuit. My experience with Jesuits before I went to Georgetown was paying for Jesuit education. And I always said the way the Jesuits practiced the option for the poor was by making me poor. My daughter's tuition I'm still paying for. But they also taught us how to think and how to act. And so in the middle, as Maureen said, in the middle of a global pandemic that seems to be catching fire again, in the middle of an economic collapse, even the stock market seems to be in big trouble, in the middle of a racial reckoning in our country, what Ignatian spirituality or Ignatian thinking asks us to do is to listen, to learn, to see the signs of the times, to reflect, to pray, and to choose the path of faith, hope, and love at a time of doubt, fear, and anger. And probably the most immediate, and I would suggest maybe the toughest place we need to use some Ignatian thinking is the choices we make about the leaders and directions for our country. It's hard for me to believe, but 45 years ago, I helped write the first bishop's statement. It was then called Political Responsibility. It was 3,100 words. The current Faithful Citizenship document is 17,000 words. I don't know if it's gotten much better with more words, but it's certainly more comprehensive. And its name has changed, but some things are really significant and consistent. Every 4 years, our bishops say to us that participation in political life is a moral obligation. It's a part of being a Catholic. It may be that the most countercultural thing the church teaches right now is not that all life is sacred. It's not that the poor ought to come first. It's not that war ought to be a last resort. It's that politics is a good thing and we have an obligation to participate. The other challenge is our participation ought to reflect what we believe, what our values are, rather than simply our pocketbook or our partisanship. If there was one sentence that would describe faithful citizenship through the years, it would be, our faith ought to shape our politics rather than the other way around. And sadly, there have been some examples of where that doesn't work. It takes its name, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, from a message of Benedict XVI that said the role of the church is not to impose its doctrine, but to form consciences so that Catholics will understand the demands of our faith and act differently, even when it involves something that might challenge our own interests. It's not a traditional voting guide, a scorecard, a menu of issues. It says consistently, we are not single issue voters. It says, as Father Jim suggested, that this is a decision to be made by Catholics, individuals voting our conscience formed by Catholic teaching. It's pretty clear on what the church's role is and the limitations of that. The church is to be political, but not partisan. We're not to be a chaplain for any party or a cheerleader for any candidate, but to challenge all. We're called to be principled, but not ideological. We shouldn't walk away from our fundamental principles of respect for life or human dignity or care for the poor. But we ought to be willing to work with lots of people who have different views to advance those values. We ought to be civil, but not silent. We should not be impugning people's motives, calling them names. But on the other hand, we ought to stand up for the poor and vulnerable, for our principles. And the church ought to be engaged, but not used. We ought to make our case in the public arena, but we shouldn't serve as props or talking points for our politicians or our parties. For me, it's really important to emphasize what Jim said. The fundamental values in faithful citizenship are conscience. As he said, it's primary. And I'll say that when I think about conscience, often it's the excuse I use to do what I want to do anyway. You know, in politics, it might be my party, my pocketbook, frankly, my prejudices. My sense is conscience asks us to do the hard things. It asks us in some ways to walk away from our party or to challenge our economic interests. Secondly, is prudence. And sometimes people say there are these fundamental principles and we have to get that right, but everything else is sort of a matter of prudence, as if that dismisses our obligations. To say something is a matter of prudence is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. When we say there's a priority for the poor, we can have a big discussion about how best to lift up the poor and help the poor to be heard. But we can't abandon the idea that the poor ought to come first. And frankly, that's an unusual idea in public life. Those are not the priorities of the Senate Finance Committee. So we need to follow our conscience. We need to exercise our prudence. But most of all, we need to be informed and involved. And as I said earlier, we need to let our faith shape our politics, not the other way around.
Well, thank you, John. I'm happy that you were able to share with us your intimate involvement with faithful citizenship. I'm really happy that you're able to talk about that. We have a real expert on that document with us tonight. And now I'd like to talk to Barbara Lee and ask her a question. Before I go on, though, I really do, I'm sure everyone has read it, but I really do want to give a plug to her wonderful book, God Isn't Finished With Me Yet. It is just phenomenal. And I'm sure everybody has read it on this call, but if not, please do. So Barbara, You know, the idea of the common good can seem so vague for people, and there's so many different definitions of it and ways of approaching it. Can you explain to us what that means in the Catholic tradition? Oh, and you're muted too. You have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. The idea of the common good goes back at least as far as Plato, and it has been examined and dissected and argued by philosophers and psychologists and theologians and lawyers and judges. And there's a lengthy section in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which I'm not going to quote, but the common denominator of these various analyses seems to be that the common good is that which promotes the good of the entire community or society rather than any individual or group of individuals within the community. That's the ideal. When we apply it to policy making, we encounter some problems. The first is the inherent tension between the society and the rights of the individual. And the second is how you define or agree on what the common good is in a pluralistic society. Now, the framers of our Constitution understood the first problem, and that's why they included the Bill of Rights. In the intervening 233 years, the constitutional rights have expanded. Some of the amendments that were extremely polarizing at the time, such as the abolition of slavery or votes for women, are universally accepted now. But meanwhile, we've seen the rise of individualism, and that is something broader and deeper than individual rights, than the rights that a government cannot take away from individuals. One example, not long ago when restrictions on indoor smoking came into widespread use, we heard some smokers loudly complaining, "What about my rights?" A right to smoke? When individual rights are really important in a free society, but when we go beyond the rights protected against government interference to individual preference, it's a whole other ballgame. We are saying that the individual is more important than the society as a whole. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in our society today. That's the first problem. Excuse me. The second one is one that our founding fathers could never have imagined. How do you define the common good in a pluralistic society? And I would just note that the Catechism of the Catholic Church doesn't really address this question either, but I'm a lawyer, not a theologian, so I'm going to stay with the founding fathers. They were white, male, Christians or deists, property owners, and people who shared the same cultural assumptions and the same ideas about society, same assumptions. Today, we are Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, non-believers, immigrants or descendants of immigrants from every corner of the globe, people of every skin color and every language. And those are only our objective differences. we also define ourselves in ways that cut across the ethnic or religious categories, depending on whether we identify as conservative or liberal, gay or straight, urban, suburban, or rural, pro-choice or pro-life, working class or part of the 1%. In this kind of a world, how do we define the common good? Or more specifically, how can we arrive at a definition that so many different people can agree on? Do we even continue to believe that there is a common good that we should bear in mind in shaping policy? Or do we live in a society that is essentially a competition among power interests, where differences at best can be resolved by negotiation or compromise, or at worst, by majoritarianism or violence? And how do we form a conscience in those circumstances? Back to you, Father Jim.
Thank you, Barbara. That's so helpful. And I especially appreciate the focus on the Constitution. It's good to have a legal mind, which one doesn't often have in these discussions. So I really appreciate that. And I know the viewers do as well. So thank you. And we'll come back to both John and Barbara. Eric, I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about the role of faith in political decision-making. You're someone with a business background and also someone who has worked in politics. And I'm just curious how one can use one's faith in decision-making, and especially if you're able to do this, to speak about Catholic social teaching as well.
Sure. Thank you very much, Father Martin, and thanks for having me here tonight. Thanks to everyone at IVC for pulling this wonderful event together. It's a delight to be here, only a shame that we are not in person. I'm particularly grateful, I would say, to be at an event hosted by Maureen. I should confess up front, I should level with you, I've only been Catholic a short time. Just a few years ago, I went through the RCIA process, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola on the Upper East Side, which Maureen was leading. And she did an even better job overseeing that process than she has overseeing this panel. So very grateful for her support on my own faith journey. Since then, I've become chair of the Social Justice Ministry at St. Ignatius. And our ministry works to raise awareness and take action on social justice issues that are aligned with Catholic social teaching. I think that too often in general, and Father Jim and Barbara and John all hit on this, and I say this as a recent Catholic, I think Catholics have the wrong idea often in the mainstream about our faith and social justice. Catholic social teaching is rooted in scripture, it's rooted in theology. We welcome the stranger, we bless the meek. And good works for the less fortunate are an important way we put our faith into action today. Standing with refugees, fighting racial and economic injustice, and showing compassion for the infirm are just as important to my faith as attending Mass, even virtual Mass. And I know many of you feel the same way. Our ministry seeks to put those goals into practice in a number of projects, many of which were obviously disrupted by the pandemic. But even while we've been convening on Zoom in the past few months, we've built a wonderful community of discussion and action, I would say, focused more recently on racial justice in particular. That's been an enormous source of comfort to me. So I think there's a personal benefit to engaging with Catholic social teaching as much as there is the broader benefit that we're all working toward. But before coming to New York, as Father Martin mentioned, and before becoming Catholic, I spent some time in Washington during the Obama administration focused on macroeconomic policies and ensuring that the president's economic decision-making was based on sound analysis. I guess to take a page from Barbara's book, I'm not a theologian or a lawyer, I'm an economist. So in many respects, I was trying to do this as dispassionately as possible. We were trying to take make decisions and do analyses in a way that was driven by things like numbers as much as possible. And to be frank, the way I thought about it at the time, driven by nebulous things like faith as little as possible. And of course, doing that kind of public service in a way that's not predisposed toward one faith or another is a central tenet of our obligations as public servants. But I think it would be intellectually dishonest for us not to acknowledge that the choices political leaders need to make, that they do involve many of the same kinds of moral questions that Catholic social teaching, our Catholic consciences in this evening's parlance, revolve around. Much like St. Ignatius's work around economic injustice that I opened with, our work around economic policy making in the Obama administration was often based around balancing competing interests, and more often than not, the interests of the rich against the poor, the strong against the weak, the entrenched, powerful few against the oppressed many. Immigration's an obvious piece of that, but these questions are things that are less salient day to day. They're important in tax policy. They're salient in how we provide educational opportunities for disadvantaged and minority youth. John opened by joking about the cost of higher education, even Jesuit education at the start of our talk. But that's a system we built in which we are distributing some of the most valuable benefits to our society in a manner that strikes me as very un-Christ-like. But I think it's worth noting that few people in DC would recognize that those sorts of policy questions intersect with Catholicism in the way that I think we are in this conversation. It's been a firm element of my experience in DC, and I don't think it'll surprise many on this call, that the intersection of Catholicism and American politics, really the intersection of faith generally in American politics, is broadly perceived in most of the superficial political discussion to be about abortion. Father Martin has written and spoken far more eloquently than I ever could about how we need to look at a broader definition, a true definition of what it means to be pro-life, one that recognizes the application of our faith to refugees, to the ill, and especially today to those who, by virtue of their circumstances, are more susceptible to COVID. But that's not always what we hear when we talk about Catholicism and politics. Rather, I think, frankly, that both our faith and our politics would be well served by a deeper recognition of the connection between Catholic social teaching and the bigger political questions of the day, particularly the respect we should have for immigrants, the recognition of the unequal advantages that family wealth, race, and gender can have on economic outcomes. But I also think it's about more than just having these opinions and talking about them on calls like this. It's also about the call to action that we each have to put our faith into action. Voting's an obvious element of that. I don't think I need to say that to this group, but it also means making sure that our commitment to our own consciences isn't just tied up in complaints about particular public policies, no matter how abhorrent, or particular politicians, no matter how corrupt, but rather committed into action to make things better. So, my fellow economists might not love hearing this, but I think faith is deeply entrenched in our politics, and we should not forget that. At the same time, by the way, I do think we often fall into a trap, and this is true of many of my friends on the progressive left as well. We often look at politicians who choose division as a means to power, who reject the stranger, and we often say that they're not real Christians. That's something that I think reflects a bit of a toxic thing, even coming from the more progressive element of our politics. I think that if you accept Christ's teaching and believe he rose from the dead, you're a Christian, no further discussion. So I don't like it when people on the left criticize problematic politicians by calling them not Christian, but they should certainly be criticized, because while the people may truly be Christian, the actions might not be consistent with the conscience as we understand it. And it's our privilege, some might even argue our obligation to act on that. And that's why IVC's work is so important. And that's why I think the conversation we're having tonight is so important. Thanks, Father Mark.
Well, thank you, Eric. You certainly don't seem like a new Catholic. Obviously, RCIA has done its good work.
I may have read a few of your books too, Father Martin. That might help.
I appreciate especially it's interesting, the kind of reminder that in Washington, people may not see the tenets of Catholic social teaching as kind of naturally part of the political discourse. So that's very helpful. So I thought now I want to thank all of the participants for their statements. I thought we'd now turn to some Q&A, and I'm going to start, I think it's good to start with the hardest question at the beginning so it can be a little easier for our participants down the line. And I think we all know what the hardest question is. In this election, I think more than any in my lifetime, I'm 60 years old, I think we've seen so many church leaders, including bishops and many priests. I'm talking about abortion, right? As as Faithful Citizenship says, John can correct me if I'm wrong, the preeminent issue. There was an article in America Today that said that it might be better to talk about it as a foundational issue. But I think the difficult thing for a lot of Catholics in this election and in general is to understand the place of other issues, which, as Pope Francis said, equally sacred are the lives of the poor and those who are already born. And I just like, maybe not in terms of policy, but I'd just like to talk to our participants about how they navigate that and how they understand that in their own decision making. I'm not asking you to say, obviously, who you're going to vote for, but how do you understand that those equally sacred things in this election? And we'll continue. I'd like to address people so people don't have they don't know when to jump in. So John, could you start with that? How do you put all those things together? There's a preeminent issue, but things are equally sacred. It can be confusing for people.
I'm a pro-life, social justice, consistent ethic Catholic, and I often feel politically homeless. Not really welcome in either party. On the Democratic side, there's some hostility to pro-life voters. On the Republican side, if you talk about welcoming immigrants and climate change is real, you don't find a home. And part of that is on us. We haven't persuaded our fellow citizens to join us in this effort. For me, the preeminent abortion as a preeminent issue is not a part of Faithful Citizenship. It's a part of the introductory note. And there was quite a dispute, actually, when the bishops met. And I wrote in that article, it was in a magazine called America. You might be familiar with that, Jim. And I said that I thought calling abortion the preeminent issue was too narrow, unfortunately. I think at a time when 225,000 people have died from coronavirus, and disproportionately poor and people of color, at a time when we still have almost 1 million abortions a year, at a time when the federal death penalty has been reinstituted by the president and the attorney general, at a time literally when Black men are being killed in our streets, the fundamental question is the life and dignity of all God's children. And it's tested, it's challenged in a variety of ways. And each of us has the responsibility to sort out how we will stand up for life. And in Faithful Citizenship, they say you have to be very focused on what they call intrinsic evils. And abortion is one of those evils, but so is racism. And at least for me, neither party is right on both. So you have to sort it through. The other question for me, a big question for me, is a question of character and competence. It's not only what you proclaim, it's actually what you do. And so I think there's a burden on partisans and people who choose to vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, not only to explain why they're supporting that person, what are the principles that call them to that task, but also to be clear about their differences. I wrote in America that for the first time in my life, I've said publicly that I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. And I'm going to do so because I can't support the president. And I'm also going to do that because of the things I think Biden can accomplish. But I do so in spite of the way he's embraced the abortion extremism of his party. And I should be public about that. And the vote, I've already voted, but that's the beginning of the process, not the end. And so we need to stand up for what we believe. We need to support our leaders in what brings us to vote for them. And frankly, we need to challenge our leaders. So we need to acknowledge the humanity of the unborn child. We need to defend the equal dignity of all God's children. And we need to fight the injustice that makes the lives difficult for lots of children. We don't have an easy choice in this election. I think we should make a clear choice. We should be explicit about why and why not we're moving forward. And then on the day after the election, in a divided country, we should be trying to heal some of the wounds and see if we can't advance what Barbara describes so eloquently as the common good.
Thank you, John. And now, Barbara, how do you negotiate all those different demands on your conscience, on your Catholic conscience?
Well, first of all, I think that one issue voting is almost always a bad idea. And I am troubled. I know so many Catholics, and I'm sure many of you do too, who say that the only issue that matters to them is abortion. So that's how they're going to vote. Now, if the Supreme Court overrules Roe v. Wade, that is not going to end abortions in the United States, because abortions will continue to be legal in many blue states. There will be more restrictive legislation in some other states, but women who are desperate will travel or will have dangerous illegal abortions. So just overruling Roe v. Wade is not a magic wand that's going to end abortion. And I think that's a misconception that some people have. So if you're voting for someone to appoint people to the Supreme Court so they'll overrule Roe v. Wade, look at the price you're paying to accomplish something that you're not going to accomplish. You're saying no to poor and hungry and homeless children whose parents have lost their jobs or their businesses. You're saying no to children, some of them infants at the breast, who were separated from their parents at the border, and now nobody can find their parents. You're saying no to all kinds of suffering on the theory that if you vote for someone who talks about abortion, you're doing something moral. Now, I'm not minimizing the evil of abortion, and I'm not saying that it isn't one consideration that people have to balance. It is an important question, but it's not the only question at a time when people are suffering so much. And I have to say, John, that when I read that abortion is the preeminent issue, I interpreted that as vote Republican. And I really resent the bishops telling me how to vote.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for putting it in context legally. That's probably the clearest I've heard it put. So thank you. Eric, how do you, you're someone who worked in politics. How do you navigate these demands on your own conscience? And by the way, I want to say, if anyone after this wants to jump in, any of the Barbara or John or Eric, just jump in to respond to someone. But Eric, what would you say? How do you negotiate all that?
Yeah, well, I'd begin by agreeing with the thrust of what John and Barbara said, but in particular, I'd like to riff a bit off the theme of political homelessness that John laid out so eloquently. Which is the way I think about that phrase. What does that phrase mean? That phrase means that you can't identify a political party of the major two viable political parties of which you have a choice where you don't agree completely. In my view, that's not something that we face uniquely as Catholics. That's something that really any group is going to face. And frankly, I tend to have a suspicion of those who claim to have a 100% alignment with an ideology as articulated by any one political party, which, by the way, is not an intellectually consistent ideology. It comes from a very messy political process of writing down what the positions are in different issues. So it's to be quite frank, a hell of a coincidence if someone is 100% aligned with every question a party raises. I actually think it's a virtue of our democracy that we are forced to confront difficult choices where we have to weigh issues against each other and come up with our own internal rankings and rankings of policy and rankings of the good and the ill that different elements of different agendas can do. And that's why I do very much agree with Barbara that in many ways, I think the bishop's position is one that tries to make that ranking for you in a way that I was personally off put by when I read it, and a little bit surprised that it was phrased so starkly. But and again, this might be with me having a history as a numbers person, but I try to look at the aggregate of which vote is going to do the most aggregate good, and that's a question that I think can never be answered reliably the same way in these sorts of contexts.
Does anyone want to respond to anything that either of the participants have said?
Well, let me just a little bit of a defense of single issue voting. I'm not a single issue voter, and I took 3,500 words in America Magazine to explain why. But in my little parish outside Washington, we're a very diverse bunch. And some of us are just going to vote our pocketbook. Some of us are just going to vote our party. Some of us won't vote at all. Some of us are going to vote our prejudices. And I'm not enthusiastic about that. But we have pro-life leaders who cannot bring themselves to vote for a party that doesn't tolerate dissent on abortion. And to use Jim's phrase, I'm not going to substitute my conscience for theirs. We have Latino families who will never vote for someone who calls immigrants rapists and murderers, ends the DACA program, and might deport members of their families. And I'm not going to substitute my judgment for theirs. We have African-American families, especially in our school, and they think we have a leader who fans the flames of racism. And that's enough for them, frankly. They're not going to off. And we have people who really work hard on climate change and the fact that they consider that an existential threat. I might try and persuade them to take a broader view, but I come from a bipartisan, a mixed marriage, actually, in Minnesota. My mother's family was Republican, my dad's Democratic. That's who we are. We are divided, and we ought to show respect for each other. We ought to respect each other's consciences. One of the problems is people who say, I'm all for conscience, but your conscience better agree with me.
Well, and also there's this tautology that is set forth by some church leaders, which is a formed conscience is a conscience that agrees with this. And if your conscience doesn't agree with this, then it's not a formed conscience, which is basically another way of saying, your conscience doesn't matter. It's once again, it's that idea from Pope Francis of, replacing consciences. Yeah, I want to say, you may know that I was invited to give a benediction at the Democratic National Convention, and normally I avoid these political things, but I realized that, if I could write a prayer that I could say at both conventions, right, sort of the right to light in general, I'd be okay doing it. And the number of Republicans who said that they couldn't believe I talked about, Black men and women and their lives, and the number of Democrats who said they couldn't believe I talked about the unborn. I think both parties, as they have their own ideologies, and I wish there were a little more room For example, I think, without getting too political, if the Democratic candidate, if Vice President Biden says something like, I know what a difficult decision this is, and I know how people struggle with this, and I know, have some sense of the difficulty of the decision, right? You know, for people, I think he'd win a lot of Catholic votes, but it is this kind of, as you say, John, this kind of extremism.
The one thing I want to say, Jim, I was really impressed by the breadth of your prayer, but even more impressive, it actually was a prayer. Most people who say prayers at political conventions, they give a speech and then we say amen. But it was real prayer, and it reflected our real faith. And I was proud to be a Catholic that night. Thank you.
Thanks.
I go back to something that John said about respect. I am the oldest person on this panel, and I actually remember when Republicans and Democrats spoke respectfully to one another. That was true in my lifetime. And we have now this awful polarization in which everything is political. Wearing a mask is political. Everything you can think of is political. And somebody comes out with a statement, and the first question is he or she a Republican or a Democrat? And once you know the answer, then you either agree or disagree. I don't think it's ever been this bad since the Civil War. We need to respect one another.
I agree, and it's, the next question is going to be about this idea of the other. So thank you, Barbara. I agree. Eric, you know, someone who's worked in Washington, I'm always curious as, you know, sort of I don't want to say you're a professional politician, certainly, but as someone
Not quite.
I know, as someone with a background, what do you see as ways of overcoming this terrible political polarization, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a question. There's a wonderful book that I just read a few weeks ago where Ezra Klein from Vox Media tries to lay this out in book form. It's called We'Re Polarizing. It's an argument that's really rooted in psychology and says that this is kind of this is not actually some abnormal end that we've gotten to by happenstance. This is an aggregate political manifestation of the way people think. We like being associated with groups. And that's not always a bad thing. I like being associated with the Catholic Church. That feels good. That's a source of comfort. That same psychological impulse is something that, you know, draws people to an identification of themselves with an individual political party. And that, I think, leads to a marriage of your political identity with which football team you support. You kind of make it a competitive like thing whose team is going to win, and that, I think, leads to rather cancerous outcomes. One point I make along these lines that connects to the earlier discussion, I think, is when John and I were going back and forth about single issue voting, I actually think John and I are closer on this issue than it might sound like. I'm of the view, particularly in this era of polarization, I'm not of the view that, quote, being a single issue voter, is necessarily a violation of one's conscience. One's conscience might lead you to that. Where I think the problem is, and I think this is also rooted in some of the, you know, organizational sources of our current polarization, is when those preferences get tied up in group identity. When we get the message from the church that voting for a pro-choice in the conventional sense Democrat is going to make you a bad Catholic, or it means that you're not aligned with this. That, to me, is a deeply ugly manifestation of this polarization that says you have to be a single issue voter. And that's the piece, to me, that I find difficult to stomach.
Let's actually, that's a great seg. Thank you. You talked about Ezra Klein's book as the sort of focus on the group identity, but I want to make a little bit of a shift now. In Pope Francis's recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which is on fraternity and social friendship, he looks at a world fractured by political and economic ideologies and challenges us and I would say one of the great, well, let's say he challenges us to see people as our neighbor, as our brother and sister, rather than seeing person from another nation, another religion, or the other. And I think the centerpiece for me of that document is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which he uses. He is a sort of a brilliant commentary on that. And I'm just curious what everyone would think about this kind of portrayal of people as the other in this election, and how it's affected Catholics and how it's affected Americans. Do you think that's something people respond to? John, what would you say? Do you think there's a lot of othering going on?
Well, I do. And I want to give Jim credit. I wrote 12 themes of the new encyclical. And then after I was done and very proud of myself, Jim said, Laudato Si was that everything is connected. And Fratelli Tutti said everyone is connected. And I thought, geez, I should have said that. It was a great summary. I do think this identity question is, I read, and I could be wrong about this, I read people would be more comfortable having someone in their family marry someone from a different religion than a different political party. I think politics has become a new religion for some of us. And as Eric has suggested, a source of identity. It strikes me, I'll tell the story that I took this position, and it was a nuanced position, was careful, I reasoned it, and I went on Fox television to talk about this. And it was, Linda and I were at dinner on a Friday night, and there was about a 75-second clip of me saying what I've said tonight, that for reasons of character, because racism was a priority for me, I couldn't support the president. I thought the Vice President Biden could unite us, even though I had disagreements. Well, my phone just exploded, my emails. One lesson is do not connect your cell phone to your office phone, even in a pandemic. But people made all sorts of judgments about who I was, what I believed, what my family was like, where I came from, where I was going to spend eternity, who I was going to spend eternity with. And it struck me they had no idea who I was. And you know what? I responded pretty sharply as well. And I had no idea who they were or what their situation is. And one woman wrote me and said, because of what you said, I gave $300 to President Trump's campaign. And every time I read your name on the web, I'm going to give $25 more. So you ought to be quiet because you're helping Donald Trump. And then she said, you make me sick to my stomach. And it said, P.S. You're an odious, if in case I haven't been clear, you're an odious person. And I thought, I'm not an odious person. I got issues, but anyway, it was late at night. I wrote her back and I said, thank you, her name. Thank you for your kind note. Let's pray for each other. And she wrote back 2 minutes later and said, touche, let's pray for each other. I suspect if we had a cup of coffee and talked about why she felt so strongly about the rights of the unborn, and I talked about my commitment to the lives of the unborn, and that I talked about how strongly I felt on the issues of race and poverty, we might not agree. We probably will never agree on who to vote for, but we would have acted like we're part of the same family, the Catholic family, and that's better than calling us names.
Yeah, I agree. Wow. Well, I'm glad you were able to respond in kind and kindly. Barbara, what do you make and what do you do about all this othering? You come at it from so many different perspectives as a spiritual director, an author, a legal scholar. What would you say about this othering that's going on?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, there is a strain of otherness that goes throughout our history. And it becomes very apparent in the late 19th century when we had waves of immigration from Southern Europe and also from China. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese were treated abominably. But now that was at a time when the nation wanted and needed immigrants. And despite that, the so-called natives, who weren't really natives at all, because we're all descendants of immigrants, unless we're native Indian, what people used to call Indians. So there's this rejection of the immigrants because they were uneducated, or because they couldn't speak English, or they were Jewish, or whatever. So there was that strain of otherness. And it really got much worse around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And now we have that for South Asians and Muslims and people from other parts of the world where we haven't had a lot of immigration before. That's one strain, and it's been, it goes way back in our history, and we don't really overcome it by proclaiming that we're a melting pot or a mosaic, which is a more modern image. The other thing, I have to put a large part of the blame on social media, because it makes this nastiness so much easier. Now, this has nothing to do with politics, but years ago when the first Kindle came out, I posted a comment on the Amazon website about something that I couldn't figure out. And I got this immediate response from somebody somewhere who was telling me how stupid I was. And, this just gets so magnified in the political context. People sit down at their computer or with their two thumbs on their phone, and they just dash off whatever bile has surfaced as they're listening to somebody. And again, there's no respect. I don't have a solution for that. Social media are part of our life, and we have to figure out how to deal with it.
Thank you, Barbara. Eric, you brought up that Ezra Klein book, and I'm just curious, when you were working for the White House, was there something that helped you not sort of work against the normal human tendency to demonize or to treat people on the other side of the aisle, or people that you disagreed with or disagreed with you, with with the kind of human response to kind of go get them or demonize them? Is there something that helped you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I can think of a few things that I think are good examples. So the broad point I'd make is there were certainly moments, and to be clear, my job was not the most political job in the building. My job was to do objective economic analysis and feed discussions. So I wasn't kind of day-to-day trenches with the rest of the aisle as much as I was trying to figure out what the right things to do. But I would say that, and this might sound a little off key, but for me, the thing that really helped me in those moments of negotiation with the other side and competition with the other side, and realize that it wasn't about me winning and me losing, what really helped was weekends. Monday through Friday, I was consumed, and I view this as I call it a sin on my behalf. I thought of it like a football competition. Yes, I went into it thinking that, these tax credits were good for the poor, and that's why we adopted it as our position. But then that stopped, and then it became about winning for a couple of days. And it was only on the weekend where I would kind of sit back and remember what I was doing at the grand point. And that I think, was good for my own mental health, but kept me, made it a much healthier experience that I had with some of the uglier parts of the day-to-day of what we were trying to do, which often did involve playing to and exploiting some of those group identity symptoms that cause deeper problems in our politics.
Well, that's good. A little ora et labora, right? I mean,
Yes, I think that's right.
You do need some downtime and some quiet time. We have a question actually from a distinguished questioner, Mary McGinnity, who I think is on the line and will be brought in, has a question for us. Mary.
I'm going to be Mary tonight.
Okay, Maureen, welcome back.
Mary asked me, Mary McGinnity, our president and CEO, thanks. She has a very interesting question that she sent in to us. So I'm going to just read it here. We are in the midst of tense times. Catholics have no political home, and as we sometimes grapple for directions or answers, how do we pray? How are we invited into a deeper relationship with God? How do we act out of a deeper connection to love? How do we walk closer with Jesus Christ during these days? And she's addressing it to Father Martin, but I'm sure other folks here will have opinions too.
Yeah, I'll start. We all have experience in that. I think one of the things that our Jesuit tradition teaches us to do, first of all, is to be honest with God in prayer. And so a lot of people I know are frightened for a number of reasons. They're tense, they're anxious, and the first thing to do is to be honest with God about that. One of my favorite models for prayer comes from Karl Rahner, the Jesuit theologian. And I came across this, I'm writing this book, it's coming out, called Learning to Pray, and I came across it in my research for Learning to Pray. And Rahner says, which I love, that Jesus's prayer is characterized by three things. This has really helped me a lot. Honesty, trust, and acceptance. And he looks at three moments in Jesus's life. Honesty, when he is in Gethsemane, and he says, remove this cup, right? So he's being honest, he doesn't want to suffer. Trust at the tomb of Lazarus in John 11, where he says, I know that you hear me, right? So he's confident that God hears him. And then acceptance, back at Gethsemane, where he says, your will, not my will, be done. I think for Catholics, we tend to overlook one of those, right? We say, well, I shouldn't be honest, I shouldn't complain, whatever. Or we don't trust that God hears us, or when whatever happens, we don't accept it. So that to me has been a helpful tool just in my own spiritual life, honesty, trust, and acceptance. I do naturally want to turn to Barbara, our spiritual director and spiritual writer. What would you say to that question from Mary, Barbara?
Well, I learned a lot about spiritual direction from you, so I'm not going to go too far away from what you've said, but in the Ignatian tradition, we are taught to find God in all things, to find the grace in all things. And I think in terrible times, in times when many of us are confined to our homes and feeling claustrophobic or depressed or who knows what, I advise people, and I try to do this myself, to take to their prayer the question, where is the grace in this? Lord, what are you asking of me in this context right now?
So very focused, thank you. Eric, what would you say in your own life? How do you approach these questions that Mary has given us?
I mean, I think the framework of honesty with God is, I think, a useful one. I think honesty with yourself is a very useful concept to answer a lot of these questions. I do think, particularly the issues we've been talking about, the intersection of these big, important political questions that we're faced with the questions about identity, and is voting this way going to make me a bad Catholic, or is voting this way going to make me is it going to make me some kind of traitor to my group, whatever that is. To me, it's a kind of inward-looking self-discernment, as well as your relationship with God, that when approached soberly is what leads you to the answer that's best for you.
And John, let me ask you, a part of Mary's question was about Jesus and where Jesus fits into this. I sometimes feel that, Catholics are great at talking about church teaching, the church, the church, the church. There was a great article by, I'm sure you knew him, John Hoy at Georgetown, a wonderful Jesuit. And he had it sort of changed the way I looked at things. He had an article called Churchianity versus Christianity. And his idea was that you talk to Catholics about, you ask Catholics about the Pope or about their bishop, they'll go on and on and on. You talk to them about Jesus and they clam up. So in your own spiritual life and in your own spiritual practice, where is Jesus in this election right now? Who is he to you and what does he mean to you right now?
Well, he may be blinding his eyes. This is pretty brutal. On churchiology during versus Christianity, I remember I haven't worked for the Bishops' Conference for 10 years, but I remember working on a really important document. I don't know if it was on welfare reform or third world debt or something. And one of the bishops raised his hand and he said, this is a wonderful document. It got our tradition really right. I think it'll make a contribution to the public debate. Do you think we could mention Jesus just once? And it reminded me, I think candidly, Jesus' example is so important. Who we walked with, who we spent his time with, what he got mad about, the way he comforted people in the middle of this mess. I find myself going back to the basics. I'm saying a prayer that my mother taught me and I taught my children to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And it's a very simple prayer. The other prayer, and it doesn't involve Jesus, but I think it is a prayer for our time, and that is the Serenity Prayer. You need to distinguish those things you can control, those things you can't. You need to make that distinction and then leave a lot to God. Father Jim has a new version of the Serenity Prayer that bothers me a lot because it says the one thing you can control is yourself. And I would like to change other people rather than change myself. But I think the example of Jesus is a powerful motivation for prayer. We had our initiative does lots of dialogues, and Jim's been a part of them, others have. And there's a real hunger. Eric talks about Catholic social teaching. We've had tens of thousands of people turn out for these things. And we had a dialogue about Pope Francis. And we had John Allen and Ross Douthat and all that. And I think it was Kim Daniels, my colleague, who was also there. And on the way home, I rode home with my daughter who had come down. And I thought this was just terrific and very sophisticated. And I said, Molly, what did you think of that? And she said, I like the woman who said, Pope Francis walks and talks like Jesus. Mm. That's what I like about the Pope. So I think the council to look to Jesus as an example and to ask him for help. People talk about practicing theology without a license. I'm practicing spirituality without a license. But look to Jesus, follow his example, and ask for his help.
I think that's a great, thank you. I think that's a great combination, because it's not simply, I mean, as Catholics, we believe he is risen and he's present to us through the Spirit. It's not simply, as you were saying, following his example. It's being in relationship with him as well. If it's okay with Maureen, I can turn to a few of the questions on the chat. Is that okay, Maureen? We have there's a few, they're all really good, but here's a really provocative one. And I'd like to throw it open to whoever wants to talk about it as we wind down. We have about 10 more minutes. At the root of all of this division is fear. There is a subconscious fear that there is not enough money, not enough jobs or opportunities, not enough good, that good is finite. Therefore, those who oppose the rights of immigrants, women, LGBTQ people, etc., are coming from a fear of not enough good and that they may lose what good there is in life. This is a great question. How do we get people to understand that there is plenty for everyone if we share? We can all have enough. I think that having empathy for this fear may help to heal some. Anyone want to jump in on that? That's a really lovely question. Basically about how do we understand the common good and is there enough for everyone? Who would like to jump in? Well, if not, I will jump in. I think that one of the most helpful things are Jesus's parables, are Jesus's examples and miracles. You look at the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes, and it's a superabundance of food for everyone, right? It's 12 baskets full. At the wedding feast of Cana, it's not just a little bit of wine; it's huge amounts of wine. If you Barbara and I have both been to Cana, and they show you a huge stone jug, basically, and it's like 4 or 5 feet tall, and there's like however many, like 6 or 7 of these. It's an immense amount, and I think one of the things that I like to do is, beyond, Eric might talk about this from an economic point of view, but from a spiritual point of view, to point out that this is one of Jesus's messages, that in the reign of God there is enough for all. And so I think to kind of inspire people that way, not just to try to convince them of it, from statistics and things like that, as important as those things are, but to remind them that this is Jesus's vision for everyone. So does anyone want to comment on that, this idea of not enough?
I would like to build off that and go back to Barbara's idea of the common good, that she explained it so well. I think part of what is at work in our politics right now are 2 different kinds of extreme individualism. I said I was from a mixed marriage, so my Republican mother would say, don't say all Republicans, but on the right and some Republicans, there is a sense that this is about economic individualism, that the market will solve all our problems. That's the measure of everything. And my dad would say some Democrats, not all, some on the left, it's about lifestyle individualism. It's about choice as the measure of all of life. And neither of those leave much room for the common good, for the poor, and for the people who've been left behind. And so part of what Catholic social teaching, which is what Eric's sharing at St. Ignatius, is this notion of solidarity, that we're one family, and that frankly our lives are enriched by assisting each other, helping each other, listening to each other, lifting each other up. And so I think our politics is driven by a kind of individualism. Somebody always says, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? The question is, are we better off? Are the poor lifted up? Are the unborn protected? Are immigrants welcome? And so a little more we, a little less I, would do our wounded church and our divided country a lot of good. Jim, you're muted.
Barbara or Eric, would you like to comment on what John said or the original question?
I mean, I would draw a big dark line under John's last few sentences, which is connecting this frame about how we get the common good to our politics. Like in the way I think about it, and yes, Father Martin, this is a bit from an economic perspective. This should be the project of our politics. The project of our politics and our collective action should be to address the failures of the market to provide to everyone. And I think we have a lot of evidence when we look at the picture of the inequality of capital, not just in terms of financial wealth, but in terms of social capital, in terms of racial and gender-based privilege around the country today. It all kind of analogizes to that economic metaphor that we've kind of concentrated things in the hands of a few, no matter what those things are. And our politics is supposed to be the mechanism for fixing that. But as John says so eloquently, as it has adopted this, again, I'll use this like sport-like competitive metaphor, it's become more about individuals and which individual is the best, when in fact, it's supposed to be quite the opposite. And I wish I had some grand theory of fixing that, besides just promoting engagement at events like this with amazing people like this group. But that to me is the central vexing question here.
We're getting a message from the mass culture, not only about the preeminence of the individual, but promoting selfishness. What's in it for me? Me first. There's a mass magazine called Us. Somehow, and I don't have the answer, but somehow we have to counter this cultural acceptance of selfishness.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, and it has been pretty much accepted, I think. One question is whether or not people think it would be a good idea. Maybe this can be our last question before we wrap up. And I don't want to focus this on Barbara, but do you think that the church should come out with a statement on the common good? Do you think that would help people to understand the demands of the decision making that we're talking about?
Well, I don't trust the church to come out with a statement that isn't in abstract language. There's a lengthy discussion of the common good in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm speaking from memory, but there are paragraphs about what is necessary for the common good. And one of the elements is peace. Okay, that's wonderful, but we can't translate that into a policy that says, okay, we need to have peace for the common good, so let's do this and we'll all be peaceful. It doesn't work that way. The church is very good at explaining abstractions. It's not so good at answering the kinds of questions that we're exploring here tonight.
John, yeah, sure. John, thank you. John, do you think the church has done in the United States, let's say, has done a decent job of explaining the common good to people? And do you think Catholics kind of really understand it?
I've spent my life trying to share Catholic social teaching, and I don't want to be evaluated on that question, the common good. Subsidiarity is not even in the spell check for word. So we have a lot of way to go. But as I said earlier, I think there's a hunger for these ideas. Young people want a moral vocabulary that pushes us forward. And our faith gives us a different way of looking at the world. And I think the church does teach about the common good every day. Tonight, I live and work in Washington. Tonight, hundreds of people are finding a place out of the wind and the rain in shelters. Parishes are sharing food. Our hospitals are providing care. I think we sometimes show the common good better than we talk about it.
Yes.
We can be an example of the common good, but these ideas provide an alternative to the polarized politics and the bitter anger that we're watching today. Whoever wins the election, we're going to be a divided country. And one of the things is the church, and by the church, I mean the people of God, not just our bishops, need to remind us that we belong to one another, and we need to move forward together, and we need to bring everybody along. And that would be my definition of the common good.
Thank you. That's a great point. Let me, before we wrap up, we only have about 2 more minutes. I want to ask Eric, did a little question sort of sideways, did Catholic social teaching play a big part of your entrance into the church? Was that something that that drew you?
Yes, certainly. And that's something I talked about with, with some clergy at my local parish as I thought about it. And it was not, to be honest with you, it was not kind of the the initial thing. It was a difficult time in my life, and that's what kind of drew me in initially. But as I learned more about the way that we think about social teaching, it was what very firmly sealed the deal for me, as it were. And I think conversations like the one we had tonight are an illustration that I made a good bet, as it were.
Well, that's great. You did, and you're very welcome. Listen, I want to, I'll turn it over to Maureen, but for myself, I want to thank John and Barbara and Eric for such a stimulating conversation, for so much preparation, and really for your own witness as Catholics in a challenging time. So, and thank you, Maureen.
Thank you. Thank you to our moderator, Father Martin. This is concluding our evening, and thank you to our wonderful panelists, to Barbara Lee, to John Carr, to Eric Van Nostrand, and thank you also to Steve Eberly, who really did a great job assisting us with the technology. But it is special for us to be able to listen to each other, and we are church, to listen to each other as community and church. Thank you to our participants, our listeners. Thank you for submitting your questions, great questions. This evening has provided us with a valuable perspectives on shaping our Catholic consciences and advancing the common good during these days. We at IVC New York, Long Island, New Jersey, Northern New Jersey, wish you a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.